The intake assessment said he was the weakest one. Not informally, not the casual judgment of a guard who had processed too many prisoners and had developed the shorthand that experience produced. Formally, with numbers. The Valeth Dominion's Prisoner Processing Division had a standardized assessment protocol that every captured combatant went through within 6 hours of intake. A protocol that measured physical capability, assessed psychological profile, evaluated potential intelligence value, and produced a composite score that determined housing assignment, security level, and the resource allocation that the holding facilities command used to decide how much attention a given prisoner warranted. The protocol had been applied to every prisoner the Keth Dominion facility had processed in its 11-year operational history. Private First Class Deo Os scored in the 14th percentile. 14th percentile meant the protocol assessed him as physically below average for a human combatant, psychologically unremarkable, and of limited intelligence, value given his rank and his unit's apparent function, which the intake assessment had catalogued as support logistics based on the equipment he had been carrying when captured, and the unit designation on his uniform. Support logistics, 14th percentile. The assessment was thorough and the assessment was accurate, and the assessment produced the conclusion that the protocol was designed to produce, which was a resource allocation recommendation. The recommendation said, standard housing block, minimum security tier, low priority monitoring. Facility Commander Veth Dreshkin reviewed the recommendation and approved it and moved to the 37 other intake assessments from the same operation, and did not think about Private First Class Deo Osa again for approximately 60 hours. He would think about him for the rest of his life after that. The housing block where low-priority minimum security prisoners were kept was in the facility's eastern section. It was not a bad facility by the standards of facilities of this type. The Valeth Dominion maintained conclave membership, and the conclave's prisoner treatment standards were enforced with sufficient seriousness that facilities operating below them created diplomatic problems that the Dominion's Foreign Affairs Division consistently flagged as more trouble than the alternative. The Eastern Bloc had adequate food, functional environmental systems, a daily exercise period, and guards who were professional if not warm. The guards in the Eastern Bloc were the guards who had been assigned to the Eastern Bloc, because the Eastern Bloc held low-priority minimum security prisoners, and the guards who had been assigned there were the ones whose performance assessments indicated they were adequate, rather than exceptional, adequate being appropriate for the task of monitoring prisoners who had been assessed as not warranting exceptional guards. This was standard resource allocation logic. It was also, the post-incident review board would later note in language that was carefully professional, and did not use the word catastrophic despite everyone on the board thinking it, a resource allocation logic that had produced a specific compounding of insufficiencies. The guards assigned to low priority were adequate. The prisoner they were monitoring had been assessed as low priority. The assessment was wrong. Private First Class Deo Os arrived in the Eastern Bloc on a Tuesday and was assigned to a cell in the second row, and was processed through the standard intake orientation by a guard named Keth who had been at the facility for 4 years, and who had done this orientation so many times that it had achieved the quality of something his body did, while his mind was elsewhere. Keth walked Osai through the facility rules, meal schedule, exercise period, communication protocols for contacting the Red Conclave, which was the prisoner welfare organization that the Conclave's standards required facilities to allow access to. Keth had done this orientation 473 times. He had done it in 47 different languages through translation systems. He had done it at 300 and at 1400, and during facility emergencies, when doing it was technically required but practically absurd. He did it now. Osai listened. He listened the way people listened when they were actually listening, which was different from the way most prisoners listened, which was the way people listened when they were processing something else and performing attention. Osai was present. His eyes were on Keth. He was absorbing the information. Keth noticed this and filed it as unusual, and then did not think about it further because unusual in orientation was not the same as concerning, and his job was to notice concerning things, and this was not concerning. He finished the orientation. Osai said, "Thank you." Keth said, "Questions?" Osai said, "The exercise period. Is it the same yard every day or does it rotate?" Keth said, "Same yard." Osai said, "And the meal schedule, the timing is fixed or does it vary by block?" Keth said, "Fixed, same time every day." Osai said, "And the guard rotation, does it follow the same pattern on weekends as weekdays?" Keth said, "Yes." He said it before he thought about it. He had answered the question the way he answered routine orientation questions, which was accurately and without consideration of what the information might be used for. Because orientation questions were routine and routine questions had routine answers, and the pattern of 473 orientations had produced a groove in his professional response that the question had slid into before the unusual nature of someone asking about guard rotations during orientation had registered. He looked at Osai. Osai said, "I am asking because I want to know the schedule. I like to have a schedule." It was plausible. It was the kind of thing that some prisoners said, the ones who coped with confinement by organizing their experience around structure. It was not an alarming statement. Keth said, "Yes, same pattern weekends." He left. He filed the orientation completion form and moved to the next task on his shift, and did not flag the guard rotation question, because the guard rotation question had been answered in the context of a plausible explanation, and had not, at the time of answering, triggered the response that a concerning question would have triggered. Later, during the post-incident review, Keth would be asked about this moment specifically. He would answer honestly. He would say, "He asked about the rotation and I answered. It seemed like a routine question in the context of the orientation. I understand now that it was not routine. I understand now what he was doing. At the time, I did not understand what I was looking at." The review board would note, in the careful professional language of review boards, that this was consistent with the findings across the entire facility staff. Nobody had understood what they were looking at. On the first day, Osai ate his meals, participated in the exercise period, spoke to several other prisoners in his block in the generic way of a new arrival finding the social landscape, and went to sleep at the standard time. The guards logged him as compliant and unremarkable. On the second day, he did the same things. The guards logged him as compliant and unremarkable. On the night of the second day, at 2:17, one of the Eastern Bloc's environmental system monitoring nodes produced a minor fault alert that the overnight duty guard resolved by running the standard diagnostic and clearing the fault, which was the correct response to a minor fault alert, and which the diagnostic confirmed had resolved the issue. The fault had been real. The resolution had been real. The cause of the fault had not been the environmental system. On the third day at 6:12, 12 minutes before the morning meal was scheduled, Private First Class Deo Os was not in his cell. The guard who discovered this was a methodical officer named Preeth, who did the morning cell check at the same time every day with the same systematic approach, and who found, at cell 7 of the second row, a cell that appeared at first glance to be occupied because the sleeping configuration in the bed was consistent with an occupied cell and had been designed to appear that way, and appeared at second glance, when Preeth's methodology required a direct visual confirmation rather than a glance. To not be occupied because the sleeping configuration was not a person, but was an arrangement of the cell's available materials that produced the visual profile of a person at the resolution that a first glance involved. Priyeth stared at the arrangement for 2 seconds. Then she activated the facility alert. The facility alert produced the response that facility alerts were designed to produce, which was the immediate lockdown of all exits, the activation of the perimeter monitoring system, and the assembly of the security response team at the central coordination point. The lockdown happened. The perimeter monitoring system activated. The security response team assembled. The perimeter monitoring system showed no breach. The exits showed no unauthorized passage. The prisoner was not in his cell and was not at the perimeter, and had not passed through an exit, and was not, as far as the monitoring system could determine, anywhere that the monitoring system covered. Commander Dreshkin was in the coordination center at 6:19. He looked at the monitoring display. He said, "Run the full facility scan." The full facility scan ran. It showed 312 prisoners in their assigned locations, 1 prisoner not in assigned location, no location found for the missing prisoner within the monitoring system's coverage. He said blind spots. His security chief, a veteran named Vorath who had been in facility security for 20 years, said, "The system has 3 known coverage gaps. 2 are in the maintenance corridors, and 1 is in the environmental system access point." Dreshkin said, "Send teams to all 3. Teams went to all 3. The maintenance corridors were clear. The environmental system access point was where the second team found what they found. They found evidence of passage, recent passage within the last several hours, and they found something else. Something that Vorath, when the team reported it, asked them to describe again because the first description had not produced a result that he knew what to do with. The team described it again. Vorath called Dreshkin. He said, "Commander, the environmental system access point shows evidence of passage. It also shows evidence of work, deliberate, skilled work on the environmental system's secondary control nodes." Dreshkin said, "What kind of work?" Vorath said, "The kind that is not immediately obvious what it accomplishes. The team's technical specialist is reviewing it now." A pause. Then Vorath said, "Commander, the technical specialist says the modifications to the secondary control nodes are not damage. They are modifications. They have been integrated into the system. They appear to have been there for some time." Dreshkin said, "Some time." Vorath said, "More than 1 day." Dreshkin said, "The prisoner has been in the facility for 3 days." Vorath said, "Yes." Dreshkin said, "What do the modifications do?" A longer pause. The technical specialist's voice came through the channel directly, bypassing Vorath, which meant the specialist had decided the information was urgent enough to skip the communication chain. The specialist said, "Commander, the modifications create a series of cascading control overrides in the environmental, security monitoring, and communication systems. They are not active yet. They appear to be set to activate at a specific trigger condition." Dreshkin said, "What trigger condition?" The specialist said, "I am still analyzing. The trigger is embedded in the modification structure. I need more time to identify it." Dreshkin said, "How long?" The specialist said, "At least an hour." Dreshkin said, "What happens when they activate?" The specialist said, "The environmental system modifications would produce a specific gas mixture in the security personnel quarters and the central coordination center. The monitoring modifications would create a 17-minute gap in the perimeter coverage on the northwestern section. The communications modifications would disable the facility's outbound emergency channel." Dreshkin was quiet for a moment. He said, "Gas." The specialist said, "Incapacitating, not lethal, based on the mixture parameters. For Valith physiology specifically, The mixture is calibrated for Valith biology. Dreshkin said, calibrated specifically for Valith biology. The specialist said, yes. Dreshkin said, by a human prisoner who has been in this facility for 3 days. The specialist said, the modifications are consistent with knowledge of Valith biological vulnerabilities that is not standard public information. Dreshkin looked at the monitoring display. He said, find him. Vorath said, we are looking. Commander, I need to tell you something else. Dreshkin said, what? Vorath said, we are reviewing the facility's communication logs from the last 3 days. The prisoner made contact with the Red Conclave Welfare Organization on day 2. Standard prisoner welfare contact. The call was monitored per protocol. Dreshkin said, and? Vorath said, the call appears standard on review, but our communications analyst flagged something. The contact on the other end of the call, the Red Conclave representative. Dreshkin said, what about them? Vorath said, they are not in the Red Conclave's personnel registry. Dreshkin said, the welfare representative is not registered with the organization whose representative they claim to be. Vorath said, no. Dreshkin said, what were they discussing for the duration of the call? Vorath said, the call is 23 minutes long. On the surface, it is a standard welfare check. The prisoner discusses his conditions. The representative asks standard welfare questions. There is nothing on the surface of the call that flagged during real-time monitoring. He said, our communications analyst says the call is clean on the surface. He said, she is running a deeper analysis now. He said, Commander, she is flagging a pattern in the call. Underneath the surface conversation, there is a secondary communication embedded in the language pattern. She needs time to decode it, but the structure is consistent with a coded exchange. Dreshkin said, the welfare call was a coded communication. Vorath said, the preliminary assessment is yes. Dreshkin said, with someone who is not registered with the Red Conclave. Vorath said, yes. Dreshkin said, who knew the prisoner was here and who he was. Vorath said, yes. Dreshkin said, and the prisoner passed information through the call. Vorath said, and received it. Dreshkin said, he received information about the facility during the welfare call. Vorath said, that is the preliminary assessment. We do not yet know the content of the coded exchange. Dreshkin looked at his display. He said, the intake assessment. Vorath said, yes. Dreshkin said, 14th percentile. Vorath said, yes. Dreshkin said, support logistics. Vorath said, that is what the assessment concluded. Dreshkin said, the assessment was based on his equipment and his unit designation. Vorath said, yes. Dreshkin said, both of which he brought into the facility. Vorath said, yes. He said, Commander, the assessment protocol assesses what it can measure. It measures physical indicators and evaluates rank and unit designation and produces a composite score. He said, it does not measure what someone has spent a significant period of their existence learning to not show. Dreshkin looked at the display for a long moment. He said, the trigger condition, the modifications, when do they activate? The specialist said, I am close to identifying it. The trigger appears to be time-based rather than condition-based, a specific time. Dreshkin said, when? The specialist said, Commander, the trigger activates in 11 minutes. Dreshkin said, evacuate the security personnel quarters. Evacuate the Central Coordination Center, now. The evacuation began. It was not complete when the trigger activated. The modifications did what they were designed to do. The gas mixture entered the security personnel quarters and the Central Coordination Center through the environmental systems and affected the personnel who had not yet cleared the spaces, incapacitating, as the specialist had said, not lethal. The perimeter monitoring went dark on the northwestern section for 17 minutes. The outbound emergency channel went down. In the 17 minutes of darkness on the northwestern section, 4 things happened. The post-incident review board documented all 4 through the recovered footage from the sections of the monitoring system that had not been affected by the modifications, which was a significant portion of the system, because the modifications had targeted specific nodes and had not addressed the full monitoring architecture, possibly because 3 days was not sufficient time to address the full architecture, possibly because the 17-minute window was sufficient for what was needed. The first thing that happened was that Private First Class Deo Os appeared in the northwestern section from a location that the monitoring system had not covered, and that the post-incident review board spent 2 weeks trying to determine was either a previously unknown blind spot or evidence of a capability they could not account for. The review board never definitively concluded which. The second thing that happened was that OSI moved to the northwestern perimeter with the specific efficiency of someone who had the facility's layout in his head and was moving through it on a route he had planned before he moved. The third thing that happened was that a small vessel appeared on the exterior of the northwestern perimeter during the 17-minute coverage gap. The vessel was not in any Valith registry. It was small. It was fast. It was there for 4 minutes. The fourth thing that happened was that when the monitoring system's coverage restored at minute 17, the northwestern section was empty, and the small vessel was gone, and Private First Class Deo Osai was not anywhere in the facility or its perimeter. He was gone. The outbound emergency channel restored 6 minutes after the monitoring. Dreshkin's first call was to facility technical systems to begin isolating and revering the remaining modifications. His second call was to the Valith Dominion's Military Intelligence Division. He described the situation. The Intelligence Division's duty officer listened. Then the duty officer said, "Private First Class, that is a junior enlisted rank." Dreshkin said, "Yes." The duty officer said, "Support Logistics Unit designation." Dreshkin said, "That is what the intake assessment recorded based on his equipment and unit designation." The duty officer said, "And the assessment score?" Dreshkin said, 14th percentile. The duty officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The modifications to the environmental system, the calibration for Valith biology, the coded welfare call, the pre-planned route, the vessel waiting at the window." Dreshkin said, "Yes." The duty officer said, "All of this in 3 days." Dreshkin said, "The welfare call was on day 2. He had been planning from before that. The modifications to the environmental system node suggest he identified the access point within the first day." The duty officer said, "Within the first day." Dreshkin said, "The fault alert on the second night was a result of his work in the access point. He had been there before the second night." The duty officer said, "He identified the blind spot, accessed the environmental system, began modifications, established a coded communication channel through the welfare system, received information he needed, completed the modifications, and exited during the window his modifications created." He said, "In 3 days." Dreshkin said, "Yes." The duty officer said, "And the intake assessment said 14th percentile." Dreshkin said, "The intake assessment measures what it measures." The duty officer was quiet again. He said, "We are going to need the full incident record, everything. The intake assessment, the monitoring logs, the communications analysis, the technical specialist's report on the modifications." Dreshkin said, "I will transmit everything." The duty officer said, "Commander, the other prisoners from the same operation, they went through the same assessment protocol." Dreshkin said, "Yes." The duty officer said, "The protocol produced scores for all of them." Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, and the scores determined their housing assignments and security levels. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer was quiet for a long moment. He said, I am going to recommend a full review of the assessment protocol as it applies to human prisoners. Dreshkin said, yes, I would recommend the same. The duty officer said, the protocol measures physical indicators and rank and unit designation. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, it does not measure. Dreshkin said, no. The duty officer said, it does not measure what 3 days in this facility just showed us it does not measure. Dreshkin said, no. The duty officer said, what do we call that? What we just saw, for the review, what is the category? Dreshkin thought about it. He thought about the environmental system modifications calibrated for Valith biology, about the coded welfare call, about the pre-planned route and the 17-minute window and the vessel waiting at the perimeter. He thought about the intake assessment and the 14th percentile and the resource allocation recommendation that had placed one adequate guard on one low-priority prisoner in one minimum security housing block. He thought about what it meant that all of that had been planned in 3 days by someone the protocol had assessed as unremarkable. He said, call it operational capability. He said, the protocol measures physical indicators. It does not measure operational capability. The operational capability of a human combatant is not visible in physical indicators or rank designation or unit classification. It is visible in what they do when you give them 3 days and a facility. He said, the protocol needs a new category. The duty officer said, yes. He said, Commander, the modifications he made to the environmental system, the technical specialists report. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, the specialist said the knowledge of Valith biological vulnerabilities in the modifications was not standard public information. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, which means it was not standard public information that he arrived with. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, which means he did not arrive with that knowledge. Dreshkin said, no. The duty officer said, the welfare call was on day 2. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, he received information he needed through the coded welfare call. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, which means someone outside the facility had the information about Valith biological vulnerabilities and transmitted it through a coded channel to a prisoner who had identified the channel vulnerability and established the communication within the first 2 days. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, the person who sent the information, the not registered welfare representative. Dreshkin said, we have not identified them. The duty officer said, no. He said, we are going to need to identify them. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, because if there is a person or a network that has the specific biological vulnerability information and has the capability to communicate it to a prisoner through a coded channel, and has the capability to position a vessel at a precise perimeter point during a precise 17-minute window. Dreshkin said, yes. The duty officer said, then the facility problem is not the only problem. Dreshkin said, no. He said, no, it is not. He looked at the empty northwestern section on his display. He thought about 3 days. He thought about what 3 days had produced in a facility that had been operating for 11 years and had held 947 prisoners and had never lost one. He thought about the intake assessment and the 14th percentile and the resource allocation recommendation and the adequate guard and the minimum security housing and all the decisions that had followed from one protocol producing one score for one prisoner. He thought about what the score had measured and what the score had not measured and the distance between the two. He said, "Update the protocol." The duty officer said, "Yes." He said, "Update it before the next intake." The duty officer said, "Yes." He said, "Update it specifically for human prisoners." The duty officer said, "What should the update say?" Dreshkin thought about it for a long moment. He said, "It should say that the existing protocol is insufficient." He said, "It should say that physical indicators and rank and unit designation do not produce an accurate assessment of operational capability for human combatants." He said, "It should say that the correct security level for a human prisoner is not determined by their intake score." The duty officer said, "What is it determined by?" Dreshkin said, "The correct security level for a human prisoner is determined by the assumption that the intake score is wrong." He said, "Assume the score is wrong. Assume the capability is higher than the score indicates. Assume that 3 days is enough time to do something you have not anticipated." He said, "And assume that if you have not anticipated what they can do in 3 days, the fault is in your anticipation." He said, "Not in their capability." The duty officer said, "That is a significant revision to the protocol." Dreshkin said, "Yes." He said, "File it." He ended the call. He sat in the Central Coordination Center, which smelled of the ventilation system, clearing the residue of the gas mixture that had incapacitated 12 of his staff, and looked at the monitoring display that showed his facility operating with a gap in the northwestern section's record, where 17 minutes of coverage should have been. He thought about the 14th percentile. He thought about 3 days. He thought that the most significant thing about Private First Class Deo Ose was not what he had done. It was what the doing of it revealed about the distance between what the protocol measured and what was actually there. The protocol had measured everything it could measure. It had not measured the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered was not in any measurement. It was in 3 days. It was in a cell that looked occupied and an environmental system that had been modified from the inside, and a welfare call that was 2 conversations at once, and a vessel that had been in exactly the right place for exactly the right amount of time. It was in the specific quality of a person for whom a facility that had held 947 prisoners and had never lost one was not an obstacle. It was a starting point. He looked at the empty northwestern section. He thought that the facility was going to need significant upgrades before it accepted another human prisoner. He thought that the upgrades were going to be inadequate anyway. He thought that was probably the lesson. He filed the incident report. He started writing the protocol revision. He did not stop writing until he had addressed everything the assessment had missed. He did not finish until morning,